The late afternoon sun bathed the streets of Redwood Falls in soft amber, casting long, peaceful shadows across the pavement. Birds chirped faintly in the distance. Lawns were trimmed. Driveways sat quietly. It was the kind of day when nothing unusual was supposed to happen, until it did. A sound cracked the calm like glass shattering against concrete. Bang! People flinched. Dogs barked. Curtains rustled as heads peeked out from behind blinds. But for Elijah Carter, there was no more time to flinch. The bullet struck him in the stomach, hard, fast, final. He stood in the middle of Summit Drive, barely 2 blocks from his mother's home. His right hand, limp at his side, held a black cell phone. His left hand clutched his abdomen, where a dark red stain began to bloom through his crisp sky blue shirt. He staggered 1 step back, then another. His knees buckled. And then, nothing, just the weight of a body that had served his country, now collapsing into the warm, uncaring pavement. There were no shouted commands, no "put your hands up," no "drop the weapon," only the echo of a single shot fired by Officer Brian Cole, a man who had made up his mind long before the trigger gave him permission. The air stood still. A leaf drifted down from a maple tree, landing softly beside Elijah's body. And in that terrible quiet, the world seemed to stop breathing. From a distance, neighbors watched, stunned, speechless. Some clutched their mouths, others held their children close. They didn't yet know the man lying there had a name, a rank, a family. They only saw what was left behind, a lifeless figure, a pool of blood, and a phone still aglow with a missed call from Mom. Brian Cole stood just feet away, gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His face, red with tension, mouth slightly open, betrayed a flood of emotion he hadn't prepared for. Rage, confusion, denial, and somewhere beneath it all, a flicker of realization. He had made a mistake, a deadly one. And the man he had just shot wasn't some nameless stranger. He was Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter, a decorated officer in the U.S. Army, but in that moment, Elijah wasn't seen as a father, a veteran, or even a man. He was just a black silhouette holding something dark in his hand. And for Officer Cole, that was all it took. No one knew it yet, but Redwood Falls was about to become the epicenter of a national reckoning. And all it took was 1 bullet, and 1 man who didn't look like he belonged. The silence after the shot wasn't peace. It was the beginning of something far louder. Before the blood, before the silence, before the single gunshot that would echo across the country, there was Elijah Carter, a man shaped by purpose, molded by discipline, and driven by a quiet but unshakable love. At Fort Liberty, North Carolina, Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter had just completed one of the most demanding weeks of his career. In the gray marble hallways of command headquarters, where the hum of tension rarely fades and decisions carry the weight of national consequence, Elijah had stood like he always did, tall, sharp, steady. He was 51. A seasoned strategist with nearly 3 decades of military service. His posture alone told stories of overseas deployments, diplomatic missions, covert briefings, and quiet nights spent writing letters to families of the fallen. He didn't seek attention. He didn't need medals to feel validated. But they were there, framed, tucked away in his study, each one earned through duty, not display. His colleagues knew him not just for his brilliance in war rooms, but for his unwavering integrity. When Elijah spoke, the room quieted, not because he raised his voice, he never had to, but because his words were deliberate, thoughtful, and heavy with meaning. He had that rare quality that couldn't be trained, earned authority. But this Friday, Elijah wasn't a commanding officer. He was a son. He had boarded a short flight to Redwood Falls, New Jersey, a quiet, polished suburb nestled in rolling hills, where his mother, Mrs. Ruth Carter, had lived since his father's passing. A retired schoolteacher, Ruth had taught English for over 40 years. She'd buried her husband, a respected judge, 3 years ago. Since then, her world had shrunk to a sunroom, a garden, and the occasional Sunday choir rehearsal. Elijah visited often, not out of obligation, but love. They spoke every week, but nothing could replace a visit. Her boy, in uniform or not, walking through the front door with that soft smile and a cake from her favorite bakery in hand. That was the plan today. He had called her early that morning, promising to pick up the strawberry chiffon cake she adored from Marion's Bakehouse on Main Street. "Don't eat too much lunch," he joked. "You'll want room for dessert." Ruth laughed and said she'd make her famous lemon tea. On the drive from the airport, Elijah played an old John Coltrane CD. The soft, smoky jazz filled the cabin of his sleek black Lexus ES350, mingling with the hum of late autumn winds that rustled gold and crimson leaves across the freeway. He wore a navy sport coat over a pressed Oxford shirt, neat but casual, fitting of a man visiting his mother, not briefing a general. His mind was quiet. No classified reports, no war games. These are just memories of childhood, of backyard baseball, of his mother's gentle correction when he misused a word, and of his father's proud silence at Elijah's officer commissioning ceremony. By the time he reached Sapphire Hills Estates, the cityscape had long given way to broad lanes, white fences, and million-dollar homes with discreet surveillance cameras and hedges trimmed like sculpture. A place of peace. Of stability, or so it seemed. He turned into the neighborhood slowly, respecting the 25 Métivier speed limit like any disciplined soldier would. The tires of his car whispered against the flawless asphalt. Autumn leaves danced around him. This was a neighborhood built to exclude chaos, not host it. But Elijah didn't think in terms of race or power when he drove through those gates. He thought of his mother's porch, the garden she still tried to tend despite arthritis. The way her eyes lit up when he walked through the door. He wasn't there to make a point. He was there to be a son. That distinction would be lost on the man watching him. Officer Brian Cole had begun his patrol of the area just 15 minutes prior. His cruiser sat idle on the corner of Maple Drive and Summit Lane, the engine ticking quietly as he sipped gas station coffee and watched for something. Anything. Then came the Lexus. Black. Polished, out-of-state plates, and inside, someone who didn't fit. That was enough. But Elijah didn't see the patrol car. He didn't see the suspicion forming. His focus was forward, 2 more blocks, then a left onto Oak Tree Circle. His mother's house, white with blue shutters, sat under a tall sycamore at the end of the cul-de-sac. He could already picture her on the porch, waving with a tea towel in her hand. In that moment, Elijah Carter was at peace. A decorated soldier, a proud father, a dutiful son. A man who had worn the flag on his chest and saluted it without cynicism. He believed in the best of this country, even when he had seen the worst of the world. He had no way of knowing that a patrol car was now behind him. That red and blue lights would soon cut across his rearview mirror. That a moment meant for family would unravel into tragedy in a matter of seconds. To the world, he was a uniform. A rank. To his mother, he was her only child. To Officer Cole, he was a threat. In just minutes, Elijah Carter would step out of his car. But right now, he was still just a man with a cake, a plan, and a heart full of good intentions. And no one, not his superiors, not his mother, not even Elijah himself, could imagine that this drive down a clean, quiet street would be his last. The quiet streets of Sapphire Hills Estates had never seen chaos. They were designed to keep it out. Gated entry, manicured hedges, and private security patrolling alongside local police. To live here meant to feel safe. Or, more precisely, to feel protected from certain people. To Officer Brian Cole, 42, Sapphire Hills wasn't just a patrol route, it was a fortress, a line between us and them. And that Friday afternoon, as the black Lexus ES350 glided past him at exactly 24 miles per hour, the line, in his mind, had been crossed. His hand instinctively moved toward the radio mic, but he didn't use it. He didn't need backup. Not yet. Not for one black man driving a luxury sedan. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't care. He just saw a profile, a silhouette, a deviation from the norm. And that was enough. With a sharp crank of the steering wheel, Cole spun his cruiser around and pressed down on the accelerator. His engine groaned as the vehicle surged forward, lights off, until he got within 2 car lengths of the Lexus. Then, red, blue, siren. Inside the Lexus, Elijah Carter glanced into the rearview mirror. A flicker of confusion. Then a sigh, tired, disappointed, but not surprised. He'd done nothing wrong. No rolling stop, no busted light. Still, here he was. Again. Elijah knew how this went. He'd lectured younger officers about it. Hell, he'd lived it. Comply first, correct later, he'd told cadets and sons of friends. You don't prove a point when there's a badge and a gun. You just get home. He signaled right and pulled to the side of the road, under the golden shade of a maple tree whose leaves danced in the breeze like they didn't know the world was about to change. Elijah turned off the engine, rolled his window halfway down, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. No sudden movements. No ego, only clarity, only calm. But Officer Cole wasn't calm. He flung open the cruiser's door and slammed it behind him. His stride toward the Lexus was stiff, deliberate, aggressive, not the walk of someone de-escalating, but of someone already building a case in his head. He rested one hand near his holstered Glock, the other adjusting his belt. He stopped just short of Elijah's window and leaned in, eyes scanning the car with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. "License and registration," he barked. No greeting, no explanation, not even a mention of a supposed violation. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react. "Good afternoon, officer," he said, voice deep but measured. "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" Cole ignored the question. His gaze traveled up and down Elijah's body, taking in the neat sport coat, the short-cropped hair, the composed expression that refused to cower. "You live here?" Cole asked sharply, voice rising slightly. "No, sir," Elijah replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I'm visiting my mother. She lives just around the corner. I'm bringing her something from the bakery." Cole scoffed. "Sure, bakery. Out-of-state plates. Fancy car. Must be nice." He was circling now, both verbally and physically, looking for cracks. For tension. For the moment he could call it suspicious. Elijah reached slowly toward the glove compartment, narrating his every move. "I'm getting my registration now." "My license is in my wallet." Cole tensed. He hand-brushed the grip of his weapon. But Elijah moved slowly, precisely. Every action is a calculation between self-preservation and protocol. He handed over the documents, license, registration, proof of insurance, with the practiced grace of a man who knew the dance all too well. "Elijah Carter," Cole read aloud. "New Jersey native?" "No, sir. I'm currently stationed in North Carolina, Fort Liberty." "Oh, military?" Cole's tone changed, but not with respect. With mockery. You boys love to throw that around like it gives you a free pass. Elijah didn't answer. Tell me. Cole leaned closer. What's a lieutenant colonel doing driving through this neighborhood? You casing houses? Scoping out which one's easiest to rob? It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. A push. A dare. Elijah's fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. His heart rate elevated, not out of fear, but fury held on a leash. I'm here to visit my mother, he repeated. I've done nothing wrong, and your insinuations are inappropriate and baseless. Cole's face flushed. The authority in Elijah's voice didn't soothe him. It ignited him. You think you can talk to me like that? He spat. You think a uniform gives you the right to run your mouth? Get out of the damn car. Elijah hesitated, not out of resistance, but calculation. Would staying inside escalate things? Would stepping out make him more vulnerable? But he saw it in Cole's eyes. The moment had arrived. The officer wanted control, and he was willing to use force to get it. Elijah slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out of the vehicle, tall, poised, unshaken. Now what? He asked, voice calm, steady. The air between them turned electric. Cole stepped forward, so close that their shoes were nearly touching. His voice dropped into a hiss. You don't belong here. You're lucky I don't throw you in the back seat just for attitude. Elijah met his gaze. You're out of line. I am the line, Cole snarled. That was the moment it all turned. The moment civility snapped under the weight of unearned power. And when Elijah, determined to protect his rights and record the interaction, reached calmly for the phone in his jacket, Officer Brian Cole reached for his gun. The tension between them was like a stretched wire, taut, vibrating, moments from snapping. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter stood tall beside his black Lexus, eyes steady, voice calm. His breathing was even, controlled, his hands visible. His posture unmistakably disciplined. Officer Brian Cole, on the other hand, was unraveling in real time. The authority he wielded was no longer about law, but about control. Not about protection, but possession of the moment. He had drawn a line in his mind between who belonged and who didn't, and Elijah's mere presence on that quiet street had crossed it. You got an attitude, Cole muttered, pacing slightly. A tone, and I don't like that. I'm asserting my rights, Elijah replied evenly. That's not attitude. That's the Constitution. Cole's jaw clenched. His hand hovered near his holster. Don't get smart with me. I'm not, Elijah said quietly. But I am recording this. It was a simple sentence, not a threat, not a warning. Just a statement of intent. And with that, Elijah reached, slowly, deliberately, into the inside pocket of his blazer to retrieve his cell phone. There was no sudden movement. No lunge, no erratic gesture. His finger slipped inside the jacket the way any civilian might when checking a vibration or pulling out a wallet. But to Officer Brian Cole, whose judgment was already clouded by suspicion, fear, and an unchecked superiority complex, this movement triggered something primal. Or maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for it. Hey! Hey! Cole barked. Hands! Show me your hands! Don't reach for... But it was already too late. The gun was out. The shot rang out. Bang. A single deafening explosion that fractured the silence of Sapphire Hills estates like a hammer against stained glass. The 9mm bullet tore through Elijah Carter's abdomen, hot metal meeting warm flesh, splitting muscle, cutting through years of discipline, dignity, and dreams. His body recoiled as if betrayed by gravity itself. A crimson burst soaked his shirt, spreading like ink across a page. His phone slipped from his hand mid-draw, clattering uselessly on the pavement. For a second, just one, he remained standing. Then his knees buckled and his tall frame folded to the ground in slow motion. He collapsed beside the very car that brought him here. The Lexus his mother was so proud he could afford. The car that, in another life, was just a symbol of success. But here it was a reason to suspect, a provocation. The air grew thick with the kind of silence that feels almost sacred. A few houses away, a child's laughter suddenly stopped. Curtains fluttered. Eyes peeked out. A dog barked once, then whimpered. And Elijah gasped. The breath was wet, shallow. His hand moved instinctively to his stomach, but it couldn't stop the bleeding, couldn't stop the betrayal. He stared upward, his eyes wide, not with fear, but disbelief. This wasn't Afghanistan. This wasn't Iraq. This was home, and this was how he would die. Officer Cole stood over him, chest heaving, weapon still aimed. His mind scrambled for an explanation, for justification, for anything. You reached, he stammered to himself. I gave commands. He didn't listen. He reached. But even he knew. Deep down, he knew. There had been no gun, no threat. Just a man, decorated, dignified, who dared to pull out a phone in his own country, on his own street, in broad daylight. A siren, somewhere in the distance, began to howl. The neighbors were already dialing. A man's been shot. There's a black man bleeding on Summit Drive. I think it was the police. The calls poured in, voices shaking, some horrified, some quiet and numb. Some said the man didn't move aggressively. Some said he looked like he was just trying to talk. Some said he reminded them of someone they knew. Because that was the truth. Elijah Carter wasn't a stranger. He was the son every mother prays for to come home. He was the soldier who never lost his sense of duty. He was the neighbor who waved, the father who listened, the citizen who believed. And now he was the man bleeding out on the asphalt, his life pooling beneath him like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Would this have happened if he were white? The ambulance screamed closer, tires screeching around the bend. Cole backed away, still clutching the Glock as if it might explain something, as if the metal in his hand would make sense of the moment spiraling out of control. He looked down at Elijah, then at the phone lying untouched beside the body. The screen cracked, still glowing. A missed call from Mom. Cole stepped back. Then again, and again. His mind whispered excuses, rehearsals. He didn't comply. He moved fast. I was afraid. But none of it drowned out the reality before him. A black man had been shot, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented in the eyes of someone who never saw past the skin. And as paramedics rushed in, hands trembling, trying to stop the bleeding, it was already clear. This wasn't just a shooting. It was an execution of assumptions, a sentence passed without trial, a phone mistaken for a gun. A citizen is mistaken for a threat, a man mistaken for less than human. Elijah Carter, lieutenant colonel, son, soldier, patriot, lay motionless under the glow of a fading sun. And the town of Redwood Falls would never be the same again. Fan 5. The first to scream wasn't the siren, it was the silence. That eerie, involuntary pause that swept across Sapphire Hills when the sound of a gunshot ruptured its carefully curated peace. For the residents, lawyers, doctors, executives who believed in quiet neighborhoods and good schools, it was the sound of something foreign, something not supposed to happen here. But it did. and within minutes the sterile white sidewalks of Sapphire Hills turned into a stage. Flashing red and blue lights bounced off manicured hedges. Yellow police tape unraveled like a curse. Neighbors clutched cell phones with trembling fingers, whispering, "He didn't have a weapon. I saw. He just reached." Word traveled fast. First, it hit the local news. Breaking: man shot by police in affluent Redwood Falls suburb. Then came the name: Elijah Carter. That changed everything. It wasn't just a man, it was Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter, United States Army. 30 years of service, top security clearance, recipient of multiple commendations. Strategic liaison to NATO, a son, a soldier. A symbol of what this country asked for and received in full. And he had been shot while unarmed during a routine traffic stop with a phone in his hand. By the time the sun set on that Friday, news anchors across the nation had cleared their teleprompters. His military photo in dress blues with silver stars and a neat white collar replaced sports scores and weather updates. That image, stoic, proud, was now juxtaposed with another. Elijah Carter was lying in a pool of blood, a black phone beside him, unanswered. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was treason to the promise of equal justice. At Fort Liberty, the command center that Elijah had departed from only hours earlier was paralyzed, not with confusion, but with grief. And rage, because Elijah wasn't just another officer, he was respected, loved. The kind of leader whose word meant something. Colonel Diane Reyes, a close colleague and fellow strategist, slammed her coffee mug against the steel table when the news alert came in. Coffee splattered across mission briefs, but no one noticed. The room went quiet. "I just spoke to him this morning," someone muttered. "He was going to see his mom." No one asked what he had done. They knew the answer already. He had driven while black. He had reached for a phone. And now he was gone. That night, a statement was issued by the Department of Defense, breaking every standard protocol of neutrality. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter was a decorated officer, an exemplary leader, and a proud defender of the United States Constitution. His death is not only a loss to the military, it is a wake-up call to the nation. And that was just the beginning. By Saturday morning, DRC Elijah Carter was trending across every social media platform, not just as a victim, but as a mirror. A mirror held up to every police department, every policymaker, every American who had ever said, "Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." Because Elijah did follow the rules. He signaled. He pulled over. He kept his hands visible. He complied. He announced his intent. He was calm. He was respectful. And still, he was killed. News networks ran montages of Elijah's career, clips of him in uniform, speaking at a memorial service, hugging soldiers returning from deployment, smiling with his mother during a Veterans Day event. The contrast was unbearable, from command headquarters to a blood-stained street, from national security briefings to a body bag, from a flag on his shoulder to one draped over his casket. The Pentagon held an emergency closed-door meeting with the Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Military Legal Counsel. The tone was not bureaucratic. It was personal. "This wasn't just a civilian," General Marshal Devereaux said, his voice hoarse with fury. "This was one of our own." The room murmured in agreement. They didn't use the word racism out loud, not yet. But everyone knew that if Elijah Carter had been white, Officer Brian Cole might have asked for a selfie, not drawn a weapon. The Army had long fought external enemies, but this was an enemy within. Meanwhile, back in Redwood Falls, Officer Brian Cole sat in an interrogation room with a legal defense team hastily assembled by the local police union. He repeated the same phrase again and again, "I feared for my life." It didn't matter that Elijah Carter had no weapon. It didn't matter that there was body cam footage up until the moment Cole conveniently forgot to turn it back on. It didn't matter that the neighbor's doorbell cameras caught the whole thing from multiple angles. Cole's narrative was unraveling. But outside that room, the streets were filling. Protesters marched to the steps of City Hall with signs reading, "A phone is not a threat. Justice for Elijah. Who do you serve?" And something was different this time. It wasn't just civil rights groups. It was military veterans, retired generals, Gold Star families, Republicans and Democrats, people who never marched before, because Elijah Carter wasn't just a symbol of injustice. He was proof that no amount of service, no number of medals, no stature or success could protect you from systemic bias if your skin was black. By Sunday evening, the President of the United States addressed the nation. We lost a hero, a patriot, a son. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter's life ended not on the battlefield abroad, but on a quiet street at home. And that should break every American heart. This cannot be who we are, but for many, it was who America had become, and the country had a choice to make. The room smelled like sweat and urgency. Deep inside the Pentagon, buried beneath layers of reinforced steel and protocol, a conference chamber known simply as Room 3A had become the new command center, not for a war overseas, but for a reckoning at home. It was 6:04 a.m., Monday. Barely 72 hours after Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter was gunned down on a suburban street for holding a phone. The building should have been sleepy at that hour, but today it was wide awake and vibrating. The Secretary of the Army sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, his brow furrowed. Around him, a dozen senior officials, generals, advisors, legal counsel, press directors, were locked in controlled chaos. Some typed furiously. Some spoke in clipped tones into secure headsets. Others just stared at the large wall screen displaying a grim rotation. Body cam freeze frame, Elijah standing calmly. Doorbell cam, the fatal shot. News ticker, Nation demands justice. Social media, justice for Elijah trending #1 for 48 hours straight. General Marshal Devereaux, Vice Chief of Staff, was the first to speak, his voice low but sharp as shrapnel. We've lost men before. To war, to train, even to accidents. But this wasn't any of those. This, he paused, choosing his words with surgical care, was state-sanctioned negligence. Carried out in daylight, against one of ours. A silence followed. Not out of shock. No one in the room was surprised by the why. Only to those it had happened to. Elijah Carter had been the system's pride. Now he was its shame. The Pentagon hadn't convened like this since 9/11. By midday, the Department of Justice had joined the Internal Command Channel. Then came the National Black Veterans Coalition, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and a private legal team assigned to the Carter family. Within hours, a tactical network of influence, media control, legal pressure, and military honor had formed. Each node with one mission: expose the rot. Name the rot, burn the rot. It started with documents. A former colleague of Officer Brian Cole from the Redwood Falls PD, a retired sergeant named Luis Martin, stepped forward anonymously. He didn't want the spotlight, he just wanted the truth. We all knew what Cole was. You could feel it in the way he talked about them, about areas going bad, about who looked out of place. His report triggered a domino effect. A pattern of complaints was uncovered, filed and quietly buried. Racially charged language during stops. Unwarranted vehicle searches. Suspiciously frequent use of officer discretion. Multiple instances of turning off his body cam, always accidental. The evidence wasn't new. It had just never mattered. Until now. Meanwhile, back in Room 3A, the military's Public Affairs Division was sharpening its own weapon, narrative control. They prepared a series of coordinated releases. 1. A full timeline of Elijah Carter's career, awards, commendations, deployments. 2. A video montage narrated by a retired general. This is who we lost. 3. A powerful open letter from active duty officers of color, published in the New York Times under the title, "If Elijah Isn't Safe, Who Among Us Is?" It was more than PR. It was warfare. A war of meaning, of symbolism, of truth against perception. But the real turning point came from an unexpected source, the Army JAG Corps, the military's legal arm. They uncovered a little-known statute, a federal clause in the Military Whistleblower Protection Act which allows high-ranking officers to request an official investigation into civilian law enforcement misconduct if it directly affects national security or military integrity. Elijah's death checked both boxes. The request was filed at 2:17 p.m. on Tuesday. By 3:03 p.m., it had been approved. And for the first time in over a decade, the Army Criminal Investigation Division, CID, was given full federal clearance to observe, audit, and challenge a civilian police department's internal investigation. What had begun as a local matter was now a national inquest. Simultaneously, civil rights attorneys representing Elijah's widow, Danielle Carter, filed a $75 million wrongful death suit against the city of Redwood Falls and its police department. But the real bombshell wasn't the amount, it was the discovery motion attached, a subpoena for all officer records related to traffic stops involving black drivers in the past 10 years. If honored, and the pressure was mounting that it would be, it could reveal a decade of racial profiling. That wasn't a civil case. That was a systemic indictment. Back in Redwood Falls, Sheriff Adam Cole, Brian's uncle and longtime police chief, held a press conference. He stood alone, no flags, no uniforms behind him. Just a microphone and an ocean of press. What happened to Lieutenant Colonel Carter is a tragedy. There are no words sufficient to undo it. But there are actions, and I support every investigation, internal, state, federal. If justice demands accountability, so be it. This badge must stand for more than protection. It must stand for truth. It was the first time the department didn't circle the wagons, because this time there was nowhere to hide. Across the country, the fallout was spreading. Police unions split in opinion, some defending Cole, others distancing themselves entirely. Mayors and governors held emergency town halls. Veterans groups lit candles outside courthouses, holding signs, "Service shouldn't end in a bullet." And then came the message that shook the foundations of the Redwood Falls legal system. A direct call from General Marshal Devereaux to District Attorney Celeste Ramirez, the lead prosecutor. "We trust you'll do your job. But if you forget what justice looks like, remember his name. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter. Remember what we gave him." And what was taken from us? The line went silent, and for Celeste, the choice became crystal clear. It began not with a protest, not with a law, not even with a verdict. It began with a voice. And it came from inside. 3 days after the shooting of Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter, a quiet but deliberate ripple started to spread across America's law enforcement agencies, courtrooms, and government offices. It didn't arrive with fury. It came with discomfort, shame, a slow, dawning awareness from those who had worn the same badge as Officer Brian Cole and knew exactly how that moment had been born. Sergeant Maria Hinojosa, a 22-year veteran of the Lakeside County Sheriff's Department, was the first to go public. Standing in uniform, her voice trembling but her eyes steady, she gave an unscheduled press statement outside her precinct. "I've served this country, and I've served my community. But I've also looked away. I've heard language in the locker room that didn't sit right. I've seen reports that didn't match the body cam footage. I've watched officers like Brian Cole justify fear with skin color, and I didn't say enough. But Elijah Carter wasn't just a name on a news crawl, he was us. He wore a uniform too, and if we stay silent now, then the rot isn't just in Cole, it's in us." Her speech, understated, unflinching, was viewed over 12 million times in 48 hours. It unlocked a floodgate. Across the country, law enforcement insiders began speaking out, not through rage, but with quiet precision. A retired internal affairs officer from Chicago PD published a scathing op-ed in The Atlantic titled, "The Reports We Buried." A young prosecutor from Florida, Tariq Blanchard, stepped down from his post and wrote a resignation letter that spread like wildfire. If Elijah Carter had pulled out a badge instead of a phone, would he still be alive? If so, then what exactly are we policing? Danger or dignity? Inside the Redwood Falls Police Department, the internal audit, initially expected to be a formality, turned into an implosion. Records showed that Officer Cole had made 212 traffic stops in the past 18 months. 186 of them were black drivers. Complaints had been filed. Warnings issued, but each one was quietly closed with the same 7 words. The officer followed department protocol. Case dismissed. Now the protocol itself was on trial. Mayor Ava Brooks of Redwood Falls, once cautious, now stood before her city in a televised address. Behind her stood no officers, only citizens. And at the center, Danielle Carter, Elijah's widow, head high, eyes dry. "We failed a man who gave this country everything," Mayor Brooks said, her voice steady. "We failed to protect him. We failed to see him, and if we're honest, we failed long before the bullet was fired. But this ends here." I'm calling for a full independent review of the Redwood Falls Police Department. Every file, every stop, every officer. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in a quiet murmur of surprise. This wasn't a performance, it was penance. In Washington, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle began to move, some cautiously, some boldly. Senator Harold King, a conservative from Georgia and former military judge, took to the Senate floor. "I knew Elijah Carter. We served together in Iraq. He was the man who volunteered for extra patrols when others hid. He was the man who stayed up nights writing letters home for soldiers who couldn't spell. And now he's gone, not to an IED, not to a sniper, to a bullet fired on American soil. If that doesn't shake you, nothing will." His voice cracked, then sharpened. "I don't care what uniform you wear. No one should be judge, jury, and executioner based on suspicion and melanin." Proposals began to fly across congressional desks. National Registry for Police Misconduct, mandatory use of body cameras with real-time cloud storage, federal standards for traffic stops, independent civilian oversight boards, mandatory implicit bias training. Some would die in committee. But some, this time, had the wind of a soldier's blood beneath them. Meanwhile, within the military establishment, change began to accelerate. The Army Inspector General launched an internal review, not of Elijah Carter, but of the system that failed to protect him when he left the base. It wasn't about blame. It was about recognition. Senior officers began holding town halls with enlisted soldiers, asking uncomfortable questions. Have you ever feared being stopped off base? Do you believe your rank protects you outside uniform? Do you believe America sees your service or your skin first? The responses were raw, painful, necessary. Captain Leon Kim, a Korean-American intelligence officer, said quietly, "We tell our soldiers to be battle-ready, but we never thought they'd need that for a grocery run in uniform." In media boardrooms, too, the tone began to shift. No longer content to just narrate the outrage, several major outlets created task forces to track racialized police violence in real time, backed by military watchdogs, civil rights organizations, and data scientists. One anchor on MSNBC ended her segment with a simple, devastating line. Elijah Carter didn't die in the fog of war. He died in the clearest light we have, daylight, truth, and denial, and America must finally choose whether it wants to see. However, perhaps the most striking image of this entire shift came not from a courtroom or a protest, but from inside a classroom. At West Point, in a lecture on military ethics, Professor Reuben Sanders paused mid-lesson and pulled up a still image of Elijah Carter in his Army blues. "Class, what do you see here?" Cadets gave the usual answers: honor, service, patriotism. Sanders waited. Then, he pulled up the image of Elijah's body lying beside his Lexus. "And now, what do you see?" The room fell silent. "Same man," he said softly. "Different skin, different clothes, different outcome?" You will go out into a world that tells you the uniform protects you. It doesn't. Not always. Your character does, your courage does, and your refusal to look away, especially when it's your own side committing the sin. The hearing room was packed. You could feel the gravity in the way people sat, still, upright. No phones, no whispers, just silence, and the faint sound of cameras clicking softly, like rain tapping against stained glass. It was the Congressional Oversight Committee, and this time the questions weren't about budgets or ballots or midterms. They were about a name: Elijah Carter. It had been 62 days since he bled out on an American sidewalk, phone still in hand. Today, his wife, Danielle Carter, was about to speak in the room where laws are shaped, reputations are made, and history pretends to listen. She didn't wear black. She wore the same deep navy suit Elijah had helped her pick for a promotion interview 5 years ago. He had called it her command armor. Now it became her shield once more. When her name was called, she stood, not quickly, not slowly, but deliberately. She took the long walk past generals, reporters, senators, and 3 framed portraits of dead presidents, each of them watching as if to say, "Let's see what you have to say, Mrs. Carter." She adjusted the microphone, folded her hands over a thin stack of handwritten notes, and began, "Good morning. My name is Danielle Carter. I am the widow of Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Carter, U.S. Army, decorated officer, strategist, father of 2, son of a retired school teacher, and the man who died because someone thought his phone was a weapon. I stand before you not as a grieving widow, though I am, not as a woman in pain, though I feel it every moment. I stand here as a mirror, and I ask each of you to look, really look, into what it reflects." She paused, not to collect herself, but to let the room absorb the weight. I've spent 2 months in rooms like this, police stations, funeral homes, press conferences. None of them ever felt like justice. I've seen my husband's face on TV more than I ever saw it in our home these past 10 years. That's the irony, isn't it? America finally sees you when you're gone. A senator shifted uncomfortably. Danielle looked directly at him, then kept going. There have been changes. I've seen them. Investigations launched, officers suspended, laws proposed. People are speaking up, some for the first time, some far too late. But I want to say this clearly. This is not justice. Justice would be my husband holding my hand at dinner. Justice would be my children not asking why Daddy's name is on protest signs. Justice would be not needing to testify to strangers about the value of a black man's life. The room grew tighter. Faces dropped. She flipped the page in her notes, but she never looked down. She already knew every word. I'm grateful for what's happened. Don't get me wrong. The Department of Justice has moved. The military has spoken loudly. Local leaders have done what they should have done years ago. But the truth is, and I need you to hear this, America didn't change because it wanted to. It changed because it was shamed. No one moved. Shame shouldn't be the engine of reform. Conscience should be. But we have spent so long turning racism into paperwork and denial into policy that we only react when the blood is too bright to ignore. One of the younger representatives, a former civil rights lawyer, nodded slowly. Another wiped their glasses. Danielle pressed forward. Elijah wasn't perfect. He snored. He left his socks everywhere. But he believed in this country. He wore the flag, fought its wars, paid its taxes. He followed the rules. And he was still shot down like a threat because a man in uniform decided his skin overrode his service. She paused. You cannot reform what you will not confront. You cannot cleanse what you refuse to admit is stained. Then she laid down the final page of her notes. The paper shook slightly in her hand, not from nerves, but from the pressure of what came next. Let me leave you with the truth. America is not broken. It's not, but it is bruised. And a bruise, untreated, doesn't heal. It hardens. I don't want my husband's name to be remembered as a hashtag. I want it to be remembered as a warning. If we do not build a system that values truth over loyalty, character over control, and lives over bias, this will happen again, and again, and again. And one day it won't just be my husband, it will be yours. Silence. Absolute silence. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the room rose. One by one, senators, journalists, officers in uniform. They didn't clap, they stood, quiet. Still, changed. Danielle Carter stepped back, gathered her papers, and left the room. She didn't look behind her. She didn't need to. The message had landed. What will we do now that we know? That's the question hanging in the air long after the speeches end, after the verdict is read, and after the flags are folded. Because this story, Elijah Carter's story, doesn't end with a death sentence or a round of applause in Congress. It ends with us. It ends with what we choose to carry forward and what we choose to leave behind. The truth is that no law can legislate humanity, and no reform can rewrite history. But we can decide what kind of country we want to be from this moment on. We can demand that body cameras stay on, not just when it's convenient. We can insist that traffic stops are not death sentences in disguise. We can raise our voices when silence is complicity, especially if we wear the badge, the robe, or the flag. And we can teach our children that justice isn't a gift. It's a fight, a promise, and a responsibility. You don't need to be a senator, a general, or a lawyer to make change. You just need to refuse to look away, refuse to let another Elijah be reduced to a headline, refuse to normalize the fear that comes with a siren behind you. Refuse to let dignity be defined by skin color, zip code, or profession. If this story moved you, don't just feel, act. Share his name, write your representatives, educate others. Reflect on your own biases. Support the voices calling for reform. Stand up, especially when it's uncomfortable. Because Elijah Carter believed in a better America. Now it's our turn to build it, and we don't need to wait for another funeral to start.